thank you all very much for coming out tonight. As a scientist, it's really important to me to convey some of what we do to the public. So like, you know, when I give a talk at a conference with other scientists, they're there because they want to give their own talks and stuff. But when I give a talk to the general public and a room fills up, it really makes me feel good. So thank you. I want to start with a story. And I want this story to drive the talk for the rest of the evening. Baby is born prematurely. The neonatologists expect that there's going to be neurological problems. But how do you know? I can't go over to him and say, how many fingers? He's an infant. He can't answer. And at the same time, this is the most critical point for me to have an intervention, whether that's a drug, some kind of therapy. His brain is never going to be more plastic than it is right now. So there's this tension. You know, I want to know now if there's something wrong, and if there is, what it is and how I can treat it. And I'm really limited in what I can do. I mean, the pediatric neurologists do an amazing job with what they've got, but what we'd like is to give them some additional tool in that toolkit to help decide. But to get to the point where we can do that, and that's research that I'm involved in at Western right now, there's a lot we have to do. And there's a lot of credit we have to give. So there's this apocryphal quote by Newton. If I've seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And it's not clear if Newton meant this sincerely or if he was being sarcastic, because Newton was a little bit arrogant. But you know, one way or the other, I mean this quote sincerely. If I've seen anything at all, it's by breaking into the garages of giants and stealing their ladders. That's how modern science works. There are individuals like Einstein who just see things differently. In my mind, they're superhuman. But for the rest of us, we look at what smarter people than us have done and steal those ideas and say, hey, I can use that to help solve my baby problem. And so that's how a lot of science gets done. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And certainly that's how my science gets done. Okay, I promised big data, and we are going to get to the big data component. But I want to start with just a couple of words on big data, because you hear that a lot these days. Dan Early, who's a pretty smart guy, has this great quote. Big data is like teen sex. Everybody is talking about it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it. So everyone also claims that they're doing it. And just like teen sex, the people who are talking the most about it probably aren't the ones who are best at it. So, you know, what is big data? We've all sort of experienced it. How many people here have an Amazon account or have ever used Amazon? So, good number. How many of you have, you know, opened your Amazon page to, you know, just browse or buy something and it says, oh, you might want to buy these 5 things. And, you know, when that happens to me, I often do want to buy at least 4 of those 5 things. It's very easy to just rack up. So they're pretty good. And that's an example of big data and machine learning figuring out what you're interested in as a customer. Now, sometimes it fails spectacularly. You've probably also had something pop up. Is that what Amazon really thinks of me? You know, this is a valid way of selling products to customers, and it works, or these companies wouldn't be so successful. Target got in the news a couple of years ago by outing a pregnant teenage girl. So what happened was she had a Target discount card, and she was buying certain products, and Target's machine learning algorithms mined that data and said, oh, most people who buy these types of products, like unscented bath soap, et cetera, are pregnant. So we'll start putting baby advertisements, formula advertisements and stuff in the customized flyer that we mail out to her. Well, her father got the flyer, called the local Target, incensed, you know, how dare you send a flyer to my teenage daughter that's trying to encourage her to get pregnant. Of course, the manager at the Target, you know, apologized and everything. The dad had to call back a week later and say, there's things going on in my house that I wasn't aware of. Turns out his daughter was, in fact, pregnant. So that's pretty scary. And so Target realized this is a problem. People are spooked out that we know too much about them, just from their buying habits. So you know what Target's solution was? We're still going to keep doing that, but now we're going to throw in like a random lawnmower ad or something, just so people aren't too creeped out by us. We're still going to do the really creepy thing, but we don't want you to be creeped out by us. So, you know, like baby formula lawnmower. Oh, well, they're clearly not data mining me. Why would I want a lawnmower? Another big element in the news recently has been what's been going on with the National Security Agency and the affiliated agencies. Edward Snowden, leaked a huge amount of information, and what they've been doing is data mining. And Canada's been involved in this data mining too. I'm wondering what they know about me, because I've used the free Wi-Fi in airports before. So they've been tracking this. And so this is a really socially relevant dimension of big data. And these problems are not trivial, right? If you can imagine trying to understand what everyone is doing in all of those Wi-Fi interactions, that's a lot. So from a scientist, from a researcher's point of view, let's narrow the focus down. The paradigm shift has been this. Even 30 years ago, what a scientist did was spent hundreds of hours in the lab, or if you're a geologist or an anthropologist, you'd be out in the field doing field work. But that's where you spent your time. And you got a tiny little bit of precious data. You could even write it down in a lab book. It was so little. And then you take that precious data back and analyze it. But the bulk of your work was gathering the data, and then the analysis was easier and could be done just by a single graduate student or a single postdoc, because it was a small amount of data. Now, you press one button and you get an inhuman amount of data. So let me give you an example. Let's take anthropology, because this is all researchers. This isn't just scientists. So anthropologists want to study societies, cultures, interactions. Twitter might be a really interesting thing to study, right? There's definitely a culture there. So you take your grad student and say, okay, I'd like you to study Twitter for a year, because that's how you think as an anthropologist. You go out in the field and spend a year with whatever culture to immerse yourself in that culture, take notes. So go ahead and do that. So this poor grad student has to read everything that happens on the Twitter public stream each day. So how much goes through Twitter? This is as of last month, in a single day. That student would have to read the entire Harry Potter series, all the books, 900 times per day. So this is what I mean when I say it's an inhuman amount of data we generate. And this is the same thing with a geneticist. It used to be if you sequenced one gene, that was your PhD thesis in a paper in Science or Nature, best journals in the world. Now, you sequence a single human genome, the whole thing, and people say, so what? You need at least 20 of those genomes to make those claims you want to make. So the data scale is inhuman, in that it's no longer possible for a single human to look at all the data and make sense of it. We have to have some automated way of helping us to filter that data to make sense of it. I want to go back now, way back, to one of the first instances of big data. And I want to use this to make a distinction between what Target is doing. They're doing what's best for them. They just want to build a statistical model of what you want to buy and suggest products to you. That's all they want to do. I'm a scientist. I want to understand why you want to buy those things. I want to understand how you work. I want to understand how the systems I study work. So big data, in the sense that the corporations are using it, is not quite good enough for me. I want to reduce things to simple models. So this gentleman here is Tycho Brahe. He was an astronomer, and he made copious observations of the heavens. Very, very meticulous, very, very careful. This planet is here at this time on this date, and just volume after volume after volume. Now, a few volumes of handwritten notes wouldn't be big data to us nowadays, because we've got computers, but when Kepler showed up to be his assistant, and Brahe said, here are all my observations of Mars. Figure out what's going on there. It felt like big data to Kepler, right? Oh boy. But what Kepler did was a really remarkable thing. Kepler didn't build a statistical model that said, I can predict where Mars is going to be 95% of the time. Kepler took those observations and he turned that raw big data into an insight. And the insight was, I can take these volumes and collapse them all down to a single quadratic equation. Mars's orbit is just an ellipse. That's what I want to do with big data. So as a scientist, I want to gather the data, and I want to use the data to help generate some insight and reduce it down to a single equation. I don't think I'm ever going to reduce the brain down to a single equation, but it's good to aim high. So before we can get to the point where we save the baby, there's a lot we have to do between now and then. And so let's start building some connections. And we're going to go all the way back to 1735. Leonhard Euler, who is a mathematician's mathematician, if you ask any mathematician who the 10 greatest mathematicians of all time are, he's going to come up. He was visiting a Prussian city called Königsberg. There's a little map of it up there. And a popular game at the time was to try to figure out if there was some way you could get through the city crossing each bridge exactly once. So you had to cross all the bridges, but you could only cross each bridge exactly once. You weren't allowed to go halfway across a bridge and then come back. You had to cross the whole bridge. So Euler heard about this game, and he did what all good mathematicians do. He said, okay, well, thinking about cities is too hard. I want to abstract this. And if you look at the city here, there's just sort of 4 land masses and some bridges. So wherever there's a landmass, I'm just going to draw a little circle. And wherever there's a bridge, I'm going to draw a little line and create this abstract object. He reasoned about that abstract object, and he proved a theorem that in the case of Königsberg, there is in fact no way you can cross each bridge exactly once without having to double back. So, sort of practical game problem turned into this beautiful abstraction. This abstraction here is called a graph. Now, usually when I say graph to an audience of non-mathematicians, people think of a chart or a plot like this, right? So I won't keep talking past this point here, I promise. But when a mathematician says a graph, they mean one of these things. So this is just an object that's got 2 kinds apart. Nodes, which we draw as little circles, and edges, which are lines linking the nodes. What are we representing with a graph? Well, relationships between things. The nodes are the things, and the edges are the relationships between those things. So they could be land masses in Königsberg and bridges. They could be, nodes would be people, and links would be if they're friends on Facebook. Okay, so it's called Classes Without Quizzes, so I'm going to do a quiz. This is a pretty easy quiz. Take a look around you, and if you see someone you know, even if it's just a passing acquaintance, point to them. So I'm going to point to a couple of people in the audience that I know. So what we're doing here is we're constructing a graph. You are the nodes, and these points are the edges. And we've actually got kind of an interesting social graph here. Now this graph has really interesting properties because it's got a nice spatial embedding. You probably know the person you're sitting beside. So you're probably pointing to this person beside you with higher probability than someone across the room, but you get the idea. Graphs are ways of abstractly reasoning about things and relationships between things. That's going to be important to us. On the psychology side, Franz Gall, 1800, was thinking, well, we know the brain is the center of the mind and it's where cognition happens. So maybe the shape of the skull, which is surely influenced by the shape of the brain, tells us something about a person. So he came up with this idea of phrenology, where you would measure someone's skull, and the thickness of various parts of the skull would tell you what kind of person they are. So there's things up there, like inhibition, and the resolution's a bit low here, so you can't see it. But the sort of things that 19th century Victorian types would be thinking about, modesty and chastity and all of these attributes. So vision is down here somewhere under the eye, and general intelligence. And so all you do is just measure someone's head, and you knew everything about them. Of course, we know it doesn't really work that way now, but it's an interesting idea, right? Even if it's not true on the skull, maybe it's true underneath the skull, in the brain. That's where this unfortunate guy comes in. 1848, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, and he had the grave misfortune of having a spike go right through his skull. And this is a beautiful reconstruction with diffusion tensor imaging of where the spike went through. And what's remarkable about him is he lived and was able to continue on as a functioning human being, but his personality changed. Prior to being spiked, he was sort of a quiet, humble, religious kind of guy. After the spike, he was very loud and obnoxious and boisterous. So, phrenology is not a real thing, but there must have been some brain areas that were responsible for him being sort of a decent human being that are now gone, and he's behaving somewhat indecently. So this served to propagate in psychology this idea that there are brain regions that do specific things. And it makes sense. And this actually kicked off a whole era of research that continues to the current day in terms of actually taking studies of brain lesions. So sometimes this is done in animals where people create lesions, but the research I'm involved with, we look at patients who have had strokes. And if those strokes are focal and just take out a small amount of the brain, then you can study that person and say, okay, well, what happened after the stroke took out this region of the brain? What do you get? So that idea, hang on to that one, because that's going to be important in our story. Hard for me to give credit for quantum mechanics to one person, so I put the whole Solvay conference up here. That's Schrodinger, who's famous for his cat thought experiment. But I'm going to give credit to Max Planck, because he's the first one who put this down in writing. And the idea is pretty simple. We've had a lot of snow, so let's think about this in terms of tobogganing. I put you on a toboggan. Let's say we're not on a hill. Kids aren't allowed to do fun things anymore. They're too dangerous. So we're just tobogganing on flat ground. If I push you really gently, you're going to expect that you don't go very far. If I push you really hard, you're going to expect that you sort of go flying. And if I push you somewhere in between, you expect that you probably go halfway between those two things. What Planck thought, and later turned out to be true, was that when you get down to the level of atoms and subatomic particles, if you think about one atom pushing another atom on an atom toboggan, there's really no such thing as a medium push. It's either the fast push or the slow push. That's it. When you get down small enough, the universe is discrete. Everything becomes quantized. It's either a 1 or a 0. It's an up or a down. It's a fast or a slow. And that idea is going to be really important to us. In fact, because of the way we want to look at brains. And in fact, shortly after this, sort of the quantum mechanics revolution, Isidore Rabi came up with this brilliant observation. And the observation is that we know, or they knew at the time, atoms acted like little magnets. Some don't, some do. Some atoms act like little magnets. And if we take these atoms, which are little magnets, and we put them in a really strong magnetic field, they do something. They either line up exactly with the magnetic field, or they line up exactly against the magnetic field. So lots will go with, but some will go against. None go at right angles to the magnetic field. This is a quantum effect. You're either with the field, or you're against the field. That's it. And the key discovery here is if I take a pulse of radio frequency energy, same type of energy that's powering the Wi-Fi in my phone here, and I hit these guys, some of them will flip back to the other direction. So some of these low energy ones will flip down. And then if I step back and I listen, and of course by listening I mean I put an antenna there and listen to the electromagnetic radiation, these guys will eventually flip back to the way they were before. And that will create a resonant signal, which is very much like the electromagnetic equivalent of singing. So this atom will sing to us. And different atoms will sing at different frequencies. So I can use this to take, say, an unknown substance in my CSI crime drama and try to figure out what makes up this substance. What are the atoms that are making up these molecules? How are these molecules bound? This is called nuclear magnetic resonance. And it's a direct consequence of understanding quantum mechanics. And it's an important tool. Hermann Carr in 1952 said, wait a minute, we can do more than just ask what atoms make up this particular substance. We can ask, how are these atoms distributed in space? And he was only able to do this in one dimension. So you sort of have a couple of beakers of water here. But he could use NMR to figure out, on one-dimensional projection, where these beakers of water were versus where they weren't. And the story sort of stalls there for a bit, because to go beyond that, you need some pretty sophisticated math and some pretty sophisticated computers, and he didn't have access to the computers that he needed at that time. So the story stalls for a bit, but we will come back to that. At the same time, roughly, computer science was starting to come into its own as a discipline. Now, I wish I had time to go into the whole history of computer development, but I don't. What you need to know for our purposes is that in 1930s, 1940s, we started to build electronic digital computers for real. So the ancient ancestors of our iPhones and our desktop PCs. And there were two sorts of computer scientists, and there still are. There is the applied computer scientists who are actually building these things and programming them and designing them, and theoretical computer scientists, which is how I started my career, who are essentially mathematicians who want to reason about the process of computation in general. What are the limits to computation, that sort of thing. This guy, Edgar Dijkstra, actually did both. He did both really well, and he knew he did both really well. It's common amongst computer scientists to measure each other's arrogance in units of nanodijkstras. So, but you know, honestly, if anyone deserves it, he does. I'm using him as a representative of a whole class of these theoretical computer scientists who took that graph theory. Remember, Euler came up with this graph theory idea just to talk about bridges in Königsberg and put it aside. The pure mathematicians took it and ran with it and created this beautiful pure theory where they were studying graphs just as graphs, just for the beauty of studying a mathematical object. The computer scientists realized pretty early on that maybe these graphs are kind of practical things. So if I use this graph here, and I use the nodes to represent airports, and the edges to represent flight between those airports, and there's the number of hours for the flight, a question I might want to ask is, what's the fastest set of flights to get from airport F to airport A? And so Dijkstra came up with a method for doing this very efficiently, called Dijkstra's shortest path algorithm. You give me two nodes in a graph and some edges, and the algorithm will find the shortest path through the graph very efficiently. So there's a whole class of computer scientists working on these types of problems. Graphs are now starting to become practical tools for reasoning about things like length of wire in our circuits in a computer. They're no longer just purely mathematical abstractions. And again, I should point out that I'm just picking individuals out of history when really there's armies of people behind each one of these things, but that would make for a very long talk. So, 1959, Paul Erdős and Alfred Rényi asked what seems like kind of a trivial question, but turned out to be quite deep. And the question was, what if I take a graph and there's no edges, it's just a bunch of nodes, and then I take every pair of nodes and I flip a coin. If it comes up head, I'm going to add an edge between them. If it comes up tails, I'm not. And I can play with those probabilities. It doesn't have to be a fair coin. It could be a loaded coin, comes up heads more often than not. But the idea is just randomly generating graphs. And these randomly generated graphs turn out to have interesting properties, and they're going to be important for our story. Erdős was quite a character. There's a movie about him called The Man Who Loved Only Numbers, and the title is pretty much true. He was the mathematical equivalent of Kwai-Chang Caine. He wandered the earth solving mathematical problems, and I mean that in the most literal sense. He didn't really have a home. He had a small apartment that he was never in, and he would just go from colleague's house to colleague's house to colleague's house, sort of stay on the couch and do math. He's one of the most prolific mathematicians ever. If you ask any mathematician, what's your Erdős number, they'll know. Mine's 3. And that means that I co-authored a paper with someone who co-authored a paper with someone who co-authored a paper with Erdős. And this is a point of pride for mathematicians. But that's how many papers he wrote. Pretty much everyone in mathematics isn't that far removed. It's like 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, only Erdős is more important to us than Kevin Bacon. There's another great story about him. He was visiting one of his collaborators and really passionate about mathematics. The collaborator and his wife were both mathematicians, and they'd gone to bed for the night. And the wife wakes up in the middle of the night and there's someone in their bedroom sitting at the foot of their bed. And she says, "Paul, is that you?" And Paul goes, "Oh, good, you're awake. Let G be a graph." And launches into his most recent proof. So he really loved it. Yeah. Alfred Rényi was a little more socially normal, but made equally profound contributions to mathematicians and is responsible for one of my favorite sayings, which is, a mathematician is a machine for turning coffee into theorems, which is pretty much spot on. Okay, so thanks to the work of Dijkstra and others, we're jumping back to magnetic resonance now. We got to the point where we had computers that could do some of the processing that Hermann Carr didn't have access to. Mansfield and Lauterbach won the Nobel Prize for being the first people to write down the maths and the whole process of how to do imaging with nuclear magnetic resonance. And it is just the same as the NMR that Isidore Rabi invented, but the people at General Electric and Siemens realized, oh, the public don't like the word nuclear too much. So let's just drop that and call it magnetic resonance imaging. Nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. So really it is NMR, but they just dropped the N so that people don't freak out. Ray Dimadian at the same time was actually building the first MR systems. And this is one of his poor postdocs who is, you're going in the magnet first. Let's see if we can get a picture of your lungs. But they did it. They took NMR within just a few decades from the setting down of quantum mechanics, a revolution in our understanding of physics, to Isidore Rabi realizing, hey, we can use this to probe the structure of molecules and to tell us something about atoms, to we can use this to get pictures of tissue inside a living human being without surgery, without doing anything harmful. We could do that with X-rays before, but X-rays are harmful. X-rays are ionizing radiation. This is completely harmless. You can have as many MRIs as you want, and it's not going to affect you. You can't say the same about X-rays. So this is a really important development. This is what an MR system looks like now. Again, not bad for a few decades worth of work. Oh, doesn't like my font. I think we can live without that particular font. So we went from this system over here to, this is Siemens state-of-the-art Prisma. There's only one of these in Canada. It's at Robarts Research Institute, and we just got it up and working 3 weeks ago. We're very proud of it. And this is a modern MR system like what you would see today. Again, remember Isidore Rabi's realization was we have to have this big, strong magnetic field. That's what this big unit here is. It's a giant superconducting electromagnet that creates the electromagnetic field that causes all of your protons to line up except for a few that go the other direction. And that's what allows us to do the imaging. I'm not going to go through all the details of the physics for NMR. Even the medical biophysics students have trouble with this the first time they see it, because there's a lot of steps. And hopefully that's the point I'm making, is that in science there's a lot of steps to get from the first early discoveries to, wow, this is a really cool application of it. What's important for our purposes is that we can get pictures of the brain. And I'll show you a picture here of my brain. So you can see it's smaller than average, but it's there, which is very reassuring. And all we're seeing at these points are different contrasts in terms of how those atoms are singing at that particular point in the brain. You can see contrast between white matter and gray matter. And there's clever ways we can do the MR. Remember I talked about those radio pulses, how we do those pulses and stuff to get different contrasts. But what we need to know for our lecture today is that this doesn't just give a 2D picture. It actually gives a 3D picture. So this is a whole volume of my head, and I've just cut through 3 specific planes here to show you pictures on a normal monitor, but the data I've actually got is fully 3D. So if you're used to the idea of a pixel on a 2D background, but like a computer screen, what we've got now are voxels. So instead of a square, I've got a bunch of little cubes. So I get the whole brain all at once. If you're familiar with the game Minecraft, in computer gaming, voxels have become a really popular way to do things. You can see this whole world is created out of tiny little voxels. And you can see the voxels if you look close enough, but if you take your glasses off and squint, it all looks very nice, and so higher resolution. 1990, Seiji Ogawa makes one of the most critical discoveries for our purposes. He realizes I can do more than just look at the structure of a brain with MR. Up to this point, that's all we did with MR. We just looked at the structure of the brain. He said, I think we can also tell something about what the brain is doing at a given point in time. This is remarkable. But the underlying idea is very simple. Think of the brain like a muscle. If you've got a muscle and you're sleeping, it's not doing much. It doesn't need much oxygen. You take that same muscle and you're doing arm curls, it's going to need a lot of oxygen because the metabolism goes way up. Maybe the same is true for brain regions. Maybe brain regions that are working really hard at a task are using a lot of oxygen, and brain regions that are not doing much aren't using much oxygen. So Ogawa figured out a way to use NMR to check, is the blood in this little voxel of brain here more or less oxygenated? And that seems like it's like several steps away from understanding thought and cognition, and it probably is, but it works really well. So this is a map of areas of the brain that are more activated when you give someone a simple task, which is just tap your finger. So you just tell them, don't tap your finger, now tap your finger. And the areas of the brain that sort of light up are these areas here, which are primary motor cortex, which is exactly what you'd expect. This part of the brain that's responsible for motor coordination. If you remember those old Canadian Heritage Moments commercial they used to have on TV, there was a famous I smell burnt toast one, and this is the work of Walter Penfield at Montreal Neurological Institute, who was the first person to sort of map out these regions and generate this sensory map on the human cortex. But this is remarkable. We've gone from NMR tells us something about the bulk properties of a substance to now I can get pictures of the brain to now I can understand which brain regions are more active using more oxygen than other brain regions during an actual task. Shortly after this, there's all of a sudden a huge interest from neuroscientists who realize we can start testing theories, especially cognitive neuroscientists, and we can test it without doing horrible experiments on people. And MR is harmless. Justine Sargent was a researcher at McGill at the time, and she had been showing people different kinds of pictures while they were in the MR, and realized that when people saw pictures of faces, there's this one particular region here on the fusiform gyrus that really seemed to be working harder than all the rest of the brain. So sort of right down here. I can't point inside my head, but sort of towards the bottom. If you take the brain and flip it upside down, it'd be right there. And so she hypothesized maybe this is a module in the brain that recognized faces. So if Phineas Gage's spike had gone right through there, then he wouldn't be able to recognize faces anymore. He had propagnosia. Justine Sargent's story is actually quite tragic, and it puts a human face on science. Scientists are under a lot of pressure to keep publishing new results, keep generating new results, so you get more funding, so you can have more students, so you can publish more results. And she was accused of scientific misconduct by her institution. And in 1994, her and her husband took their lives. And she left a note saying that she had not done anything dishonest, but she couldn't handle the environment in which she found herself. And it's a real tragedy. At the time, there weren't a lot of mental health resources for scientists. It's kind of like, suck it up and just keep going. And the committee at McGill that was supposed to determine if there was ever misconduct or not never ended up filing a report. And I can sympathize with them. If their findings were that there was misconduct, do you want to smear the name of your departed colleague? But it puts a humanizing face on science, and we lost a really bright star. She was the first person to recognize this. Fortunately, the research wasn't lost. Nancy Canwisher in the US picked up on this, named the area the fusiform face area. That's a really strong hypothesis that goes back to Phineas Gage and to Gall, really. I mean, Gall said it was the bump on your head that would give you your ability to recognize faces. Canwisher is saying it's this chunk of gray matter that lets you recognize faces. So this is an interesting theoretical development in biology. Happier story, Stephen Strogatz in 1997, one of the top American applied mathematicians and fierce advocate for educating children in mathematics, and Duncan Watts, who is from Guelph, Ontario, went back and looked at these graphs. Remember, Erdős and Renyi were looking at random graphs where you just sort of flipped a coin. And they said, well, these random graphs are at one end of a spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum is, if you can imagine a piece of graph paper, perfect lines in both directions. Every place the lines meet, I put one of these nodes. I get a very regular graph called a lattice. If I sort of fold that over on itself into a circle, it looks like this. So each node is connected to its neighbor and to its neighbor's neighbor. And that's it. You just go regularly around that. So this graph has a nice property that if you want to get to your neighbor, you only have to traverse one edge. But if you want to get all the way across the graph, you have to bounce a lot. Erdős and Renyi's random graphs have almost the opposite property. It can be really hard to get to my neighbor. I might have to bounce all over the graph to come back and get to my neighbor. But there are shortcuts through the graph where I can get all the way across the graph in one go. So neither of those graphs are really optimal, right? This is the street grid on a city where there's no expressway. This is the street grid in Boston. If you've ever had to drive in Boston, you know this is what it looks like. This is what you want. This is a street grid with the 401, maybe not 401, 407. So you've got some shortcuts through it. So this is a graph that started off as a lattice, and then I just grabbed a couple of nodes and took their edges and said, OK, instead of this edge going here, I'm going to send it further out. So I'm still got most of my nodes are connected to their neighbors, but now there's these shortcuts. And this makes it really easy to get through the graph with a small number of hops. It's sort of the best of both worlds. And as you might expect, natural systems and constructed engineered systems often end up having this small world property because it's so useful. This was a critical theoretical breakthrough from our point of view. So what are some of the properties of graphs we might be interested in? Simple one is degree. You just count the number of neighbors. This is your Facebook friends graph. This person's got 4 friends. This person's only got 2. Pretty simple. This node's probably more important than this one. Betweenness is another nice concept. Remember Dijkstra had this algorithm for finding the shortest path through a graph? What I'm going to do is take every pair of nodes in the graph and say, what's the shortest path from this node to this node? And then I'm going to keep track of how often each other node participates in those shortest paths. So this node here participates in a lot of the shortest paths through this very simple graph. If I take him out, this graph is in real trouble. If I take this node out, it has very low betweenness. The rest of the graph doesn't care. Everyone can still talk to everybody else. And transitivity, again, we'll do this in terms of social graphs. If I'm friends with you and you're friends with her, what's the probability that the two of us are also friends? And we know that if you think about your own friends group, it's probably reasonably high. If I'm friends with you and you, probably you're also friends. But we all have our compartmentalized groups of friends, and so there'll be some differences there. So those are properties of individual nodes on a graph. And I can also ask about overall properties of the graph. So I can ask, in this graph, how often are friends of friends also friends? Or I can just go through and say, how many nodes in this graph have degree 1? How many people only have 1 friend? How many people have 2 friends? How many people have 3 friends? And that gives me sort of a nice, at a glance, what kind of graph is this? And then I can apply this to all sorts of different artificial and natural constructs. And this has been done in the literature. Social networks, power networks, networks of proteins that interact with each other in the human metabolome, the internet itself, and brain graphs. That's where we want to end up, is those brain graphs. 2001, Jim Haxby did a really interesting experiment. So remember Justine Sargent had shown that this part of the brain really works hard when people look at pictures of faces. Haxby showed people pictures of houses, and that same part of the brain worked really hard when looking at houses. So this isn't the fusiform face area anymore. This is the fusiform house area. And he actually went further. And it also lights up when you show people pictures of shoes. If the person is a shoe aficionado, it lights up even stronger. No, this is a real thing. There's papers on this. So if someone has no interest in cars, this will only light up a little bit when you show them a car. If they're an antique car nut, that area will be brighter than for faces. So what Haxby's showing here is maybe there's more to this than we thought. Maybe there isn't just one region for one simple psychological thing. Maybe we need to reevaluate this sort of fMRI-based phrenology. This is the region of the brain for looking at pictures of cats on the internet. This is the region for wasting time at work. Oh, wait, those are the same region. Yeah. Maybe there's more going on. There's more depth to it. So around that time, sort of in general in neuroscience, people were moving towards this network idea. The brain is a network of pieces that work with each other rather than just a module that does this task, a module that does this task. So we've moved away from phenology into a network theory of the brain. And right around 2003, Olaf Sporns in the US and Ed Bullmore in the UK started applying actual graph theory, like what we'd seen from Euler and Erdős and Dijkstra, to understanding the networks that are present in the human brain. So this is where we're going to pick up. We have gone through a lot of history now. Can we please save the baby? First thing is, how am I going to use MRI to get graphs? And the answer is we just do something very straightforward. I take two of these voxels in a brain, and for each of these voxels, the MRI is telling me, here's how much oxygenated blood there is at this point in time. And so I do that for a bunch of points in time. So I'll get like a little plot like this where, okay, there's more or less activity, you know, depending on what that brain region is doing at that point in time. And I take those two brain regions and I just ask, how similar are those two plots? So if two brain regions have plots that move lockstep like that, they're very similar. If they sort of have no relationship at all, they're not similar. There's lots of ways of doing that mathematically, but they're all just, you know, simplified, asking that question. How much does this look like this? So what I do is each one of those voxels becomes the node in a graph. I compare those oxygenated blood flows and say if they're similar enough, I'm going to add an edge between those two nodes. And that graph is going to tell me all these different brain regions, how well are they talking to each other during this task? How synchronized is their activity? If they're all moving together, then they're probably highly synchronized. They're probably working together. If they're not, then I'm going to conclude that they're not working together. So is this big data? Well, that 3T MR I showed you, the scans we get off of it, the nodes are about 15,000 to 30,000 in number, and we get between 300,000 and 3 million edges. Robarts also has Canada's only 7 Tesla, so higher magnetic field MR. It's one of only 50 in the world. And with that one, we get higher resolution. So we've got 50 to 100,000 nodes. This is a big graph. You can't just sort of look at it and make sense of it anymore. And 3 million to 300 million edges. And what's more is we're rescanning that brain every 850 milliseconds to 2 seconds, depending on which particular protocol we're doing. So we've got one of these graphs with potentially 300 million edges coming at us every 2 seconds. It's pretty big data. For Amazon, they'd be like, that's nothing. But I'm not Amazon. For me, this is big data. And because I'm doing this dynamically, I'm not interested in just the graph of the brain. When someone is doing different tasks, or even when they're doing different parts of the same task, different brain regions are going to be talking to each other. So what I'm really interested in is how those communication patterns change. So neuroscientists, you know, the systems cognitive neuroscience started off as this is the brain region for doing this. Now it's moved to a more network view where there's a bunch of brain regions that work together for this particular task. My own pet theory, and I can't prove this yet, this is just me hypothesizing here, is that what's really interesting isn't even the regions themselves, but it's the patterns of how those regions talk to each other. So what you perceive as conscious experience, what you perceive as, you know, your moment-to-moment mental activity in the world is actually the transformation of these communications graphs. It's in the changing of how these regions communicate with each other that cognition happens. And I mean, that's not totally my idea. There's a huge literature on global workspace theory and things like this, but no one's framed it in graph terms yet because it's really hard to prove. So I can't offer any evidence for this, but you know, the idea is, what if the network itself is the computation? So that's Marshall McLuhan, right? What if the medium is the message? What if the network is the computation? So I've got a lot of data coming at me very fast. This isn't big data. This is high momentum data, right? Velocity times mass. We got a lot of data. What I really want is results in real time. So if I'm going to use this clinically, if this is going to be relevant for a patient, especially for our baby, we have to think carefully about what we're doing. This process here, where we build graphs from brain activity, The way it's done in research labs right now, you do the scan with the patient, you take the data back, your postdoc works on it for a week. If they're really good, you might get it in 3 or 4 days. If they're a bit lazy, you might get it in 2 weeks. That's no good in a clinical context, because often we find that whatever experiment we did, it didn't give us the result we wanted. So now we have to bring the subject back. Not a big deal for a researcher, but for a clinician, that's costing OHIP money. That's increasing the patient agony index. How many people here have had an MRI before? I have, and I'm horribly claustrophobic. So I've had a few now, so it's terrible. You don't want to go back, right? You don't want that phone call that says, no, we didn't get what we wanted, you're going to have to come back. And in the baby case, it's even worse. We want to intervene with treatment as soon as possible. If it takes us 2 weeks to figure out, oh, we didn't even do the right tests, that's a problem. What we really want is tests where we can do them and get real-time feedback. So up to this point in time, there's no way to do graph dynamics in real time. I'm privileged to work with a really fantastically hardworking group of people who have now made this a possibility. So what we do is we take someone, we put them in the scanner, we do some pre-processing on that MR data, but really, at the core of it, what we're getting is just these oxygenated blood flows, and we're saying, do they work together, do they not work together? We build a graph from that, and to do that, we're using an IBM cloud computing system that's through the Southern Ontario Smart Computer Innovation Platform, Smart Computing Innovation Platform. The acronym is SOCIP. This is why you don't let VPs come up with acronyms. That's Paul Young, the VPR at U of T. It's his fault for that name. But it's a really nice system, and we need some pretty heavy compute power to do this. Then we can take those graphs, we can project them back into brain space and say, okay, which are the most important nodes in these graphs? What are the hub nodes? What are the nodes with high betweenness? We can project that onto a laptop to a clinician who's sitting right there in the control room. That clinician can then decide, this isn't working, let's try something different. On the spot while the patient is still in the scanner. With pediatrics, that's critical. With non-compliant patient populations, which is often where you'd want to do this, so schizophrenic or autistic patients, this is also critical, because you don't want to put them through the trauma of having to have another scan done. So we can now do real-time adaptive scanning. So that's an example from my scan. This is me in the scanner being claustrophobic. This is what my brain looks like. These are the parts of my brain that are most involved in claustrophobia. I think I was more relaxed at this point. I'm actually going to try and call up the website. We've got a website set up so you allow that. So hopefully this works. It'll load up and it'll actually show you one of the displays that we can show to clinicians while we have a patient in the scanner. So we don't actually have someone in the scanner right now. This is a this is a canned recording of my brain with me worrying about whether or not this is all going to work out. Because we did a live demo of this a year ago. I was giving a presentation in Toronto, and we had a subject in the scanner here in London, and the data was going across the internet and being processed in the IBM cloud, and it all actually worked. This was from our earlier integration testing. Each one of those dots there is a node in a graph. It's a part of my brain, and if two parts of my brain are talking to each other, are working together, then there's an edge between them. And you can sort of see this ebb and flow in the graph as it goes back and forth. From these graphs, we can pull out quantitative metrics. So if I switch to my full display here, and this might take a minute. There we go.
Can I ask what the red and blue dots?
Oh, what the different colors are?
Yeah.
All I've done is nodes that have higher degree, so they've got lots of neighbors. I've colored them with a brighter color, so they're colored orange. Nodes that are sort of less important, I've colored blue. So all those different metrics I told you about that you can get from graphs, we can plot those. So a simple one is just, what's the average degree in this graph? So if, what's the average number of friends each one of my brain regions has in this graph? And here it is evolving over time. And what we can do is scan a bunch of normal babies and develop bounds for these metrics. We can say normal babies should have an average node degree between 1 and 6. Clinician can do their experiment, same experiment we did with the normal babies, and say, this baby's a 10, or this baby's a 1. That's abnormal. Now we know we need to follow up with some kind of treatment. So this gives us a tool for making diagnoses, and it gives us a tool for quantifying things that may be difficult to quantify. One of the things I really hope that this does, not with neonates, but also with adults, is mental illness still has this horrible stigma in our society. People think, oh, that's not really real illness. If you just sort of toughened up enough, then you'd be able to get through it. It's not like cancer. If I can give you a number and show you that that number is different in a depressed person than it is in a person who's not depressed, and I can, there's a growing literature on this, that makes depression look like a real physiological thing, because it is a real physiological thing. And so hopefully that will help change some of the attitudes we have in our society, still pervading how we approach mental illness. Okay, so I can tell you what's wrong. In the case of the baby, this is still kind of tragic. You know, I said, here's what's wrong, but I can't offer you any solutions. So here is our most recent idea, and we're just working on this right now. We take the baby, we put them in the scanner, we hook up our full system, and when the baby's brain starts having metrics go within the bounds of what we expect for a normal baby, we play a recording of mom singing a lullaby. That's as close as we can get to, you know, giving them a juice reward or something, right? You know, you want to reward them for good behavior. When their brain starts to drift away from a network configuration that we would think of as neurotypical, mom's voice fades out. So it becomes a neurofeedback system. When the brain has desired network properties, we reinforce that with lullaby for mom. When the brain drifts away from that, we stop. I have no idea if that will work. We also want to try this treatment on adults, you know, like early onset schizoaffective disorder. That's known to be a network disorder of the brain. I don't know if this will work. It probably won't. Most scientific research doesn't, but at least it's a try. And it's something that our real-time system enables us to get out there and try. So how much progress have we made getting this to the actual baby who needs it? That's a neonatal incubator with an MR coil built right into it. They're so cute. You put the little preemie in there. And babies are really hard to image because they, you know, with an adult, if you've had an MR, you know the technician tells you stay still or hold your breath. You can't tell an infant to stay still. You wait for them to fall asleep. And we've also been developing new motion correction algorithms to just handle the fact that they thrash around a lot. But to show you, we are taking baby steps. This is an infant that my collaborator, Rodri Cusack's group, imaged down at Victoria Hospital here. And you can see I'm not lying to you. This isn't an adult MR that I've just shrunk down in size. You look at the shoulder to head width ratio there. You can see it as a baby. You can also look at the size of the ventricles here. The ventricles in human have a lot of fluid in them. In an infant, there's not much extra space to go around there. So this is an infant listening to a pre-recorded lullaby. It's not mom in this case, it's someone else singing the lullaby. And you build the graph, and then you look at the regions that are most dynamically involved during the lullaby and its primary auditory cortex, right where we expect it. So we're not anywhere near diagnosing and curing them yet, but we are taking the first steps towards that. So we can save the baby because Euler went to Königsberg in 1735 and got interested in bridges. Gall decided that the human brain must inform the shape of the skull and that one region was responsible for one thing. Poor Phineas Gage got a spike through his head and lived and was still a functional human being, but a different one, and kicked off the whole field of lesion studies. Max Planck realized that the world is discrete, not continuous. Isidore Rabi took that, developed nuclear magnetic resonance. Herman Carr realized that nuclear magnetic resonance could do more than tell us what this was. It could tell us about the spatial distribution of that thing. Edsger Dijkstra and a whole generation of computer scientists started taking Euler's graph theory and turning it into a more pragmatic working man's tool instead of a beautiful mathematical abstraction. Erdős and Renyi started asking crazy questions about, well, what if we just randomly generate these graphs? And it turns out those graphs have interesting structure. Mansfield, Lauterbach, and Demadian finally get to the point, thanks to the efforts of people like Dijkstra, where they have the computational power they need to take Herman Carr's program to its full extension, which is now we can actually use NMR to make pictures of a living human being without damaging them. Sergei Ogawa jumps on that and realizes we can do even better. We can take images of a brain in action. We can tell not just what the brain looks like, but what it's doing. Justine Sargent recognizes that and identifies parts of the brain that are really strongly involved in face processing and kicks off a whole field of cognitive neuroscientists where people are looking for this brain region does this task. Strogatz and Watts realize that random graphs and lattices are just two extremes in a continuum of different types of graphs and identify small world graphs, which people then realize show up all over the place in nature and in engineered systems. And finally, we combine all those things into a network theory of neuroscience, which hopefully allows us to make some progress towards diagnosing and treating infants and adults with network disorders of the brain. Just like none of these advancements are possible without this whole web of connections preceding us, none of these advancements are possible without an army of people helping us do these things. There are areas, I do some mathematics still, and there are some pure mathematicians where just one guy goes off in a room and moves the world forward. Grigori Perelman, who solved the Poincaré conjecture. Terry Tao at UCLA is another example. So there are disciplines where that happens. Disciplines where you're doing biomedical research, it's not possible for one person to do it. So this group up here is my team, my lab. These are the people who are actually making this happen, working on the ground every day. This is Rodri Cusack, our collaborator, who's working directly with the infants, and his lab. You can see how many people there are there, and all of these people made integral contributions to the system I briefly described there. These are the folks that funded everything, and finally, these are my two most important lab assistants. Now, you'll notice that traditionally, the human occipital lobe is right here at the back, but kids these days like to wear their hats backwards, so that's what's going on there. Thank you all so much for coming tonight.